In 1968, a Japanese engineer named Hideo Itokawa watched a crowd gather in a Tokyo auditorium. They were not there to see a rock star, they were there to see a rocket scientist. Itokawa wasn't loud, and he didn't wear a uniform. He was a soft-spoken man who built tiny rockets in a post-war lab with almost no budget. His first launches failed, the fourth went 5 feet into the air, but the fifth worked, and then the sixth went higher, slowly, and piece by piece, he built Japan's first space program with slide rules and borrowed tools. The press called him Dr. Rocket, not because of some mythic achievement, but because he kept showing up. Japan's space program has never been built on slogans. It is built on endurance. It doesn't demand attention, it earns it. And in a world full of noise, that might be the most powerful quality a nation can have. Today, we're going to look at whether that quiet effort is enough to turn Japan into a 21st century superpower. We'll look at JAXA's real capabilities, the geopolitical landscape, the military constraints, and the private sector's growing role. It's not about hype, it's about whether Japan's methodical, restrained, and sometimes underrated space effort could be its path to lasting power. Let's begin. Hello, I'm Gene Botkin, and before we begin, take a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It is the easiest decision you'll make today, and it helps keep the channel running without asking Mitsubishi for a sponsorship. So here's the deal. Japan has a space program. It is called JAXA. Most people outside of Japan have never heard of it. That's because it doesn't do much self-promotion. It does not have any countdown hype videos, and no billionaires are giving TED Talks about Mars on behalf of JAXA. It just builds spacecraft, launches them, and usually succeeds. In 2020, Japan sent a spacecraft called Hayabusa 2 to an asteroid, scooped up a sample, and flew it back to Earth. It landed in the Australian desert like it was dropping off a package. There was no big announcement, no victory parade, and they barely raised their voices. It was the ideal Japanese touchdown. And that's how Japan operates in space. It is not flashy, it doesn't do live streams with emotional music, it treats space like a serious job and not a reality show, which is refreshing, if slightly confusing. And then there's Japan's SLIM. That stands for Smart Lander for Investigating Moon. Japan built it to prove that they could land with extreme accuracy. Not somewhere in this general region accuracy, but more like right there on that specific rock. And it worked. It was quiet, and it was oddly impressive. So why does this matter? Because while other countries are chasing attention, Japan is building quietly and getting quite good at it. That quiet consistency might be the most underrated path to power in space. So what exactly is JAXA, and how did it end up running one of the most competent space programs you've never heard of? Japan's space agency is called JAXA. It stands for Japan Aerospace Exploration Agency, which is a long way of saying they handle space stuff. Think of it like NASA, but with less merchandising. JAXA was formed in 2003 when Japan merged a few different research organizations. Instead of reinventing the wheel, they welded together the wheels and got them back to work. Instead of reinventing the wheel, they welded the wheels together and got back to work. The agency has one main job: to ensure that Japan does not get left behind in the space race. And so far, they're doing that with admirable competence. Most people don't hear about JAXA because JAXA doesn't really market itself. They're not trying to sell you branded hoodies, they don't name rockets after Greek gods, and the names sound more like printer models: H-2A, Epsilon, and HTV. Very useful, very boring. But the launches go up, the missions get done, and nobody makes a scene, which in this field is pretty rare. They've partnered with NASA, the European Space Agency, and many others. They built part of the International Space Station. They've launched satellites for weather, disaster monitoring, and space science. They've landed on asteroids, and recently they landed on the moon, all while barely saying a word about it. It's like if your neighbor built a satellite dish out of spare car parts and didn't bother to bring it up. But here's the most interesting and inspiring aspect of JAXA. JAXA has a small budget compared to other space agencies, yet they still manage to pull off missions that bigger programs either take longer to do or quietly cancel. And that efficiency is not an accident. It is baked into how Japan works. What does Japan really get from its space exploration activities? Because for a country that claims it's not trying to be powerful, it is doing an excellent job at pretending. So what does Japan really get out of the new space race? Because it doesn't have a moon base plan with a fancy name. So, what does Japan get from its space exploration effort? It doesn't have a moon base plan with a name like Operation Eternal Dawn. It doesn't talk about Mars colonies or space hotels. And if you ask JAXA what the point of all of this is, you would not get a dramatic speech. You'd get a document, probably in PDF format. But beneath the surface, there is a clear strategy. Japan relies on space more than most people think. It has no oil, no wide open plains, and no friendly neighbors. What it does have are coastlines, cities, and supply chains that need to be monitored, mapped, and protected. Space-based systems do all of that. Satellites track typhoons, earthquakes, and military movements. They keep the country functioning, and they do it from orbit. And that's where the geopolitical aspect comes in. Because Japan lives in a rough neighborhood. China is launching more rockets than anyone else. North Korea is firing missiles for attention. And the US, Japan's main ally, is busy juggling 10 other crises. Japan does not want to fall behind. Space gives it leverage that is technological, economic, and strategic. And that answers the question of what does Japan really get from space? From space, Japan gets stability, accuracy, and a seat at the grown-up table. It does not need to dominate the cosmos. It needs to secure its place in the system that is coming next, one where space is part of everyday infrastructure and no longer relegated to science fiction. At least, that's the bet. Japan is building quietly, and it's building for permanence. It wants to be useful. It wants to ensure its relevance when the rules of the new space order are written. Moreover, space offers Japan a way to work around military restrictions without breaking them. Moreover, space offers Japan a pathway to working around military restrictions without breaking them. And that matters far more than most people realize. Because Japan's constitution has a line that says that it can't have a military that does anything aggressive. This was written after World War II, when military power was not exactly a good look. As a result, Japan has what is called a self-defense force. It is like a military that refuses to call itself one, even when it is operating jets, submarines, and missile defense systems. This force extends to space. Japan cannot legally build space weapons. It cannot send offensive satellites. And it definitely can't talk about space dominance. But here's what it can do. It can build surveillance satellites, launch missile tracking systems, and quietly share data with the US Space Force, which it does constantly. So instead of a space force, Japan has a space component inside its air self-defense force. It is like giving a ninja a business card that says consultant. The job is the same, but the paperwork is different. Japan has also been putting more satellites into orbit that look a lot like early warning and reconnaissance systems. Officially, they are there for peaceful purposes, but unofficially, they are there in case things stop being peaceful. Because the reality is that Japan cannot afford to fall behind militarily, even if its laws require it. So it works around the rules. It cooperates with allies. It builds dual-use systems, and it avoids calling attention to any of it. It is a slow and careful buildup, but it is happening, and it's probably farther along than most people think. So now, given the fact that Japan cannot possess a proper space force, it must rely on the private sector for an inordinate amount of support in the space domain. What is the private sector doing, and how could Japanese companies end up taking Japan farther into space than any government plan ever could? While the government keeps things modest, Japan's private companies have started doing things that border on the ridiculous, in a good way. There is one company called iSpace that tried to land a commercial spacecraft on the moon. It failed to stick the landing. There is a company called iSpace that tried to land a commercial spacecraft on the moon. It did not stick the landing, but the fact that a private Japanese firm even got that close is impressive. It is like someone parallel parking into orbit, slightly misjudging the curb, and still getting points for style. And then there's Mitsubishi Heavy Industries. You probably know them for air conditioners and industrial machines, but as it turns out, they also build rockets, and not small ones. Mitsubishi launched the H-2A and now the H-3, which carry satellites into space with the same energy as a veteran truck driver backing a trailer into a tight alley. No fuss, no flair, just results. Japan's companies do not make a big show of it. You do not see Elon Musk-style live streams or branded countdown parties. You see launch footage, a brief statement, and then silence. But behind that silence is something important: momentum. These companies are not guessing, they're building, slowly, responsibly, and with the long term in mind. This matters because Japan's government is cautious, but the private sector can make it move faster. It can take risks. It can build lunar landers, deep space probes, and satellite constellations, while the public side handles diplomacy and regulations. Together, they create a system that is quietly getting better. Not flashy, not rushed, but stable. And that stability is beginning to look like a real path to space leadership. But will that leadership enable Japan to become a major superpower? Well, it depends on what you mean by superpower. If you're thinking of tanks on the moon and speeches from low orbit, probably not. Japan is not trying to lead with volume. It is trying to lead with competence. In military terms, Japan still relies heavily on the United States. It doesn't have the freedom or the appetite for open dominance. But in terms of space capability, Japan is already one of the few countries that can design, build, launch, and recover spacecraft without anyone's help. That's a short list, and Japan is on it. Yet, being a superpower is not always about being the loudest, and yet, despite the conduct of the United States, being a superpower isn't always about being the loudest or the most aggressive. Sometimes it's about showing up early, staying late, and being the one country that everyone else quietly depends on. Japan is carving out that role, whether it's in climate data, moon landings, or satellite partnerships. Other nations already rely on Japan's space assets far more than they realize. And add to that a private sector that is becoming bolder and a government that knows how to stay consistent, and you've got the makings of a major space power. Not a headline-chasing one, but a durable one. So can Japan's space program make it a superpower? Not in the Hollywood sense, but in the real world, where trust, reliability, and precision matter more than photo ops. It's already happening. And so Japan proves itself to be a sobering point of reality in a world that is becoming increasingly clownish. It isn't chasing dominance, it is building reliability. It isn't trying to lead every headline, it's trying to be the country everyone quietly counts on when the hardware matters. That approach does not make for dramatic footage, but it does make for staying power. In space, consistency beats charisma, and Japan understands that. It shows up, does the job, and prepares for the next mission without ceremony. And that's the kind of story we follow here. Nations that build power the hard way, not the loud way. If that's the kind of space coverage you value, then stick around, like this video, and subscribe to the channel. We'll keep following the signals worth watching. No noise, no gimmicks, just the facts that shape the future. Thanks for watching. With Elenarda, I'm Gene Botkin. End transmission.